So we are, I think.
We are live.
Online, right? Okay. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to a new webinar in water resources and environment here at Universidad de Chile. This is the first webinar of this semester, the fall semester here in the Southern Hemisphere. Today we have a great and awesome speaker. His name is Willem Vervoort, and he's a professor in hydrology and catchment management and director of the IRC Training Center in Data Analytics for Resources and Environments at the University of Sydney. Professor Willem is the leading hydrologist at the University of Sydney and an expert in quantitative hydrology and catchment management. His main research focus is the development of sustainable water management in relation to a varying climate, leveraging a long association with agricultural research and agricultural production. So Professor Willem, thank you so much for being with us today. It's an honor for us to have you here. So yeah, that's it. I think in honor of the time, I think the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
Thank you all. So yeah, straight away share my screen. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, and again, apologies for not being in Chile. That was partly my fault, and I really should be paying more attention next time when I go and travel somewhere. But anyway, also we'll now have to do this via Zoom. So yes, today, so I wanted to talk about the use of simulation modeling, which is really what I do most of the time to provide sustainable management. Can we actually do this? And what are some of the issues, and what are some of the things that I've been working on. So I'm with the University of Sydney, and officially I'm with the School of Life and Environmental Sciences, but I've got these two other affiliations. One is with I'm the director of the ARC Training Center in Data Analytics and for Resources and Environment, and I'm also part of the Sydney Institute of Agriculture. So first I'll give a quick overview of those two organizations. Let's see if I can change my screen. Yes. So there is a training center funded by the federal government in Australia and funded by industry partners. And the vision is that we want to be a world-leading higher degree by research, so a PhD training center that addresses the urgent need of the resource sector, which it has for skills and expertise in data science. And we actually have one HDI candidate who is from Chile, so Fabian Leal. So he's one of our HDI candidates at the moment. And what we do, we basically focus on novel data science methods. So we are more than just analyzing data. We actually are interested in developing methods to figure out new ways of actually analyzing data, new ways of actually predicting data, forecasting, and particularly focused on uncertainty quantification in the resources and environment sector, and that's through collaboration with our industry partners. So the whole focus is around transformation of the actual industry by training HDI candidates. So focus areas are minerals, biodiversity, and water. And we have a team of 20 CIs, 4 postdoctoral researchers, 2 research engineers, and then 16 HDI candidates, which are all from around the world. And so we have a bunch of different organizations that are our partners, as well as 5 different universities. And we're about halfway in our funding cycle, so we've got 2.5 more years to go in that. The other group that I'm associated with is the Sydney Institute of Agriculture, which is a research group within the University of Sydney, basically, and brings together all the leading research in agriculture from the university. And here's a list of the things that we focus on, which is quite a long list. I mainly work in the area of carbon, water, and soil, but there's a whole bunch of other things that people are interested in that have links again to data science in another way through, for example, digital agriculture and several other aspects of this. And so this is another kind of association of mine. Okay, so now getting back to the point that I wanted to the topic of the talk, which is sustainable water management. And I put in two photos here, which are two photos of a river that Ignacio, who's my former PhD candidate, and now Dr. Ignacio, I should say, of course, knows well. This is the Nemoy River, actually near Narrabri, where we've done some of our work. And you can see that this is what it looked like kind of in 2019, the bottom photo. And the top photo is what it looks like this year. And it just shows you the difference through the different ENSO cycles within Australia. And where you can have 1 year where there's basically no water at all, and this is a major river used for irrigation water supply, and you can have other years where there's lots of water. So in principle, the problem with sustainable water management, even though we talk about sustainable water management as something that is actually good for the environment, it's actually very human-centric, of course, because in the end, if we have no humans, all the water is going to be used by ecology. And you can say, well, then, it'll, there'll be more growth and more things that maybe that we can tap into. And that's really the question is how much water can we use without actually having any major long-term impacts on ecology and the landscape? That's really what we're after. In essence, humans want to keep using natural resources into the future. That's really the issue that we have, right? We want to just continue using this, and we think that it'll be available to us in the future. So fundamentally, we're trying to manage demand and supply, and which of course is extra difficult under a highly variable climate. So if the climate flips around a lot, where you have big droughts and high floods, then it's much harder to try and figure out what actually demand and supply is and how much water is available. So the difficulty with the demand and supply management is that the water balance is closed. There is no extra water. So on the one hand, that seems logical, but people keep forgetting that. People think, okay, we found new groundwater. No, you didn't find new groundwater. The groundwater was always there. There is no real extra water. It's just part of the water balance somewhere. And so basically what we're trying to do is with this, graph is trying to show with some random data is you given the annual variability that you have, the orange and the blue lines, you would like to balance, to have some time, a long-term balance of supply and demand. And in a way, this is actually the same as, the government is trying to do with their budget, right? That's basically what they're trying to do. They have year-to-year variations, but in the end, they would like some time a long-term balance. And so it requires understanding and recognition, so there's a typo there, recognition of the long-term variability of the resource, right? You want to understand how it varies and what the variations mean and how you actually, what that means in terms of your demand and supply and your long-term balance. There's a couple of things that make water specifically difficult to try and manage and to try and do this long-term supply and demand balancing. So for groundwater particularly, but for water in general, there are what is called actions at a distance. So not all the things are happening here and now if you extract water, right? So if you extract water now, the effect is actually not direct, and it could take quite a long time. It could be delayed, and there are responses of that actual effect over large distances. The reason for that is, of course, because water connects the overall the ecosystem. And so it really connects everything from groundwater to atmosphere. And so it really requires the groundwater management, or water management in general, requires this landscape, continental view of the actual water balance. And that doesn't happen often. Most people concentrate on just their own location, their own activity, their own basin, their own valley, whatever it is. And really, sometimes you need to think about this in a very large scale. The other big problem, of course, that we also have is that the processes are dynamic, and as we talked about, and changing in time. And so we talk about these processes being non-stationary if you think about it from a classical perspective, right? So they change in time, and we'd like to think about the processes being stationary. That is because then we can think about them from a modeling perspective. They're easier to deal with. They have some kind of long-term stability, but that's not necessarily true. And so we really, within our lifetime or within our data set, that stationarity is not always guaranteed. So really, sometimes we really want to think about, is there some way of explaining non-stationary in time and space? Because, you know, there's been some arguments in the literature, and particularly from the statistical point of view, that non-stationarity is actually only a matter of scale, right? If you look at a certain scale within the data, then it might seem non-stationary, but if you actually look at a much larger scale, then it still is stationary, right? But our window of observation, of course, tends to be small, and we then talk about it as being non-stationary. So we need to think about what actually makes it non-stationary. Okay, so, and of course, the big non-stationary factor at the moment that we're working with is climate change. So climate change is, of course, the major challenge for this in the next generation of humans. And for Australia, what that means is that climate change is increasing the variability. We have more and extreme droughts, as we've had before, and we have is in 2019, and we have more and extreme floods as we've had in the last 2 years. So this is really makes it even more difficult to try and think about the sustainability. So change will also affect natural systems, because if we think about more and extreme droughts, we also will have an effect that people will start changing their extraction pattern, that people will start using water differently, but also the impact of the actual extraction or the impact of the actual use of water will change, because there's an overall drought. And if we take that last bit of water, how is that affecting the actual system, rather than if we take the first bit of water, right? Is that the same? Are you at a different aspect of the stress curve? So really, constantly what we're thinking about is, what is the bit that we can actually manage to maintain the sustainability? And is that management effective and efficient? So what part of the actual overall cycle can we actually manage? And what are we managing? And is that actually effective and efficient? So when we think about management and management of policy, it assumes a cause and effect relationship that can be manipulated, right? We think we have, if we do this, then this will change, and that will happen in the end. And that means, you know, we have some impact on the actual water cycle. So the cause and effect relationship in that actual management needs to be identifiable. And so we often talk about science-based management and policy. So, but what it does actually, it often applies results from smaller observation scales to very large entities. We have a study for 3 years. We have a study in a small catchment. We have a study in a experimental site that we use to try and make decisions into science of much larger scales, the whole of the country, multiple catchments, a big catchment, something like that. And the reason, of course, why we do that is because this is costs of observations, right? So we tend to scale whatever we do in time and space. It's much more expensive to do something at very large scales than it is to do something at a small scale. So we tend to just concentrate on actually measuring things at a very small scale, and then scale that in time and in space. Of course, data alone are not enough, because catchment and landscapes are very complex, and there are many interacting processes and human activities. And so when we think about this whole of catchments, we can't really measure everything yet, right? So we tend to take snapshots of whatever we see. And so that's the reason why I concentrate on simulation models, and lots of people work with simulation models when we talk about management, because simulation models integrate that data, or try to integrate that data, and that can help developing scenarios, right? So the idea with the simulation model is that it can guide its management policy, because it can develop sustainable management options, hopefully, because we can run a model for 100 years, even if we have data for only 10 years. Now, part of that might be random number generation, but in general, we can do that. You know, again, just re-emphasizing, landscape and catchment are shared spaces we have between environment and the humans, even though we manipulate them and we try to do things within the environment. And sustainability really formalizes just that sharing concept, right? We're just minimizing the impact on other users. And of course, water management is a key element of the sustainable landscapes, because water is a key agent of change, through the climate forcing, and water indicators are relatively easy to track. We can relatively easily measure how much water is in a river and things like that. So the other thing is that, of course, water becomes a bigger agent as the climate dries. So it's important. So here's an example, the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, right, which we're trying to manage for sustainable water. So we've got 1 million square kilometers, we've got 5 states and territories, and we're trying to manage, trying to do sustainable water management. So there is no way on 1 million square kilometers that we're going to measure everything, right? So the only way we can try and do some kind of assessment of the actual sustainability is through simulation modeling. So there's extensive simulation modeling within the Murray-Darling Basin for management around sustainable diversion limits for all the catchments. So the idea is, if we can identify how much water we are able to extract, then we can set limits to extractions. We can then include that within our water markets. We can include that within our regulations and decision making. So we have an understanding of what is a sustainable diversion limit, right? So that's a big assumption, that we can assess a sustainable diversion limit. And the way to track that in Australia is that we actually look at what are called key ecological indicator sites. So across the Murray-Darling Basin, there are 18 to 20 key ecological indicator sites. There are more indicator sites, but there are 80 to 20 that are really the most important ones. And there, for example, the way you got to think about is there are wetlands, which have international value. There are other, indicator sites that they look at in terms of fauna and flora and things like that, and water. And so then we need to think about it. Okay, how do we actually measure what is there, and how do we predict that? So what actually is, even though we call this an ecological indicator site, what actually is a good indicator? What is it? Should it be very sensitive? Should it be robust? Should it be? And so there might be a mixture of indicators that we think about and that we're trying to predict. So that's what they've done. They've chosen certain indicators, for example, habitat indicators of, aquatic species, or certain aquatic species that they look at, or certain vegetation that they look at, or water levels. And so in the end, it comes down to water levels, because that's what people are looking at, can measure, right? So this was used, and then a model was designed, and a model was used for decision making. But there's a key complaint. So then that was released, and there were the sustainable water, the diversion limits were defined. And of course, as we say in Australia, then the shit hit the fan, right? And really what happened was we get these major complaints about this whole process. And one of the key complaints was that the modeling was highly secretive. We will run the numbers and the science behind closed doors, and then we'll tell you the results, right? So it's highly secretive. That's what people talk about. So there was a real lack of stakeholder consultation to actually develop the plan and to try and communicate that to the actual users. And so the problem with that was that you lose trust, because people start thinking all kinds of, especially in, nowadays, conspiracy theories and everything else. So you lose this trust in the development of the plan. And can you actually regain that trust? Is there some way of regaining that trust? So one of the comments, this all comes out of an inquiry that was done into the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, or into the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, is one way to help that would be full disclosure and explanation of the initial modeling, right? And so the MDBA didn't do that, and they won't do this. So the result is that we lost this trust. And the key issue of that, of course, that you want a disclosure of uncertainties in the processes. What's been included, what's not been included, what does that mean in terms of uncertainties? Anyway, so thinking about sustainable water management, it seems that it's very important that we actually include those uncertainties, that we understand the processes. Now, that's not easy, and I'm not saying that I solved that problem, but let's just discuss this a little bit further. So we have models. We're hydrologists. Of course, we can model things. We're engineers. So our model's up to the task. So management implies cause and effect, right? So we need to know this cause and effect. So what that means is that models need to represent the actual management scale. They need to be able to say, well, we manage actually at this scale, and we need to be, and it needs to be able to capture this management cause and effect at that scale. And so traditionally, of course, in hydrology, we have basically three options. We have process-based distributed models, we have got lumped conceptual models, and then we've got data-based models. And then we've got, of course, non-stationarity, and how do all these models deal with non-stationarity. And I always, in my teaching, refer back to this paper by Fries and Harlan, which is very old, 1969 by now. But, well, it's not that old because I'm not that old. But anyway, the reason why this paper is interesting, because if you actually read this paper, you look at the model that they designed, then you go, really, nothing has much changed since that paper in terms of hydrological modeling. This is basically the same model as, you know, all the models, looks the same as all the models that we currently use, right? So even though we think that there is progress in this science, at this end, it seems like a lot of the models actually haven't changed much at all. So one option, like we said, process-based distributed models. And we know that distributed models are really great because they can model all the variation in time and space. And there's been papers written about this. And they really are the closest representation of the real world digital twin, right? So the complexity can be important, even though simple models can capture the broad scale variation. But it's very important because you can actually try and capture all the different processes that you understand. It can often simulate a range of processes, not just water or just carbon, but there are also interactions between different processes and impact on further variables, for example, pesticide modeling. But the biggest problem with distributed models is, of course, that they're highly affected by this information detail trade-off, right? Can we actually observe and model all the processes that we want to include? And in the end, we're still, of course, doing an approximation because we're still dealing with some sort of digital twin, right? Because if you keep zooming in to a certain scale, when do you stop with the processes, right? In the end, the hydraulic conductivity Darcy's law is a approximation of the actual process. It's not actual the process. So I always, I always refer back to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the book from Douglas Adams, and where there's this guy. If you remember, maybe those of you have read the book, where people have read the book, it's a comedy, right? It's a very funny book. But anyway, there's this person who's actually trying to remake the Earth. So they're rebuilding the Earth, another species somewhere out in the galaxy who are rebuilding the Earth. And one of the people is trying to make, one of the persons in that book, although he's not human, is trying to remodel the fjords of Norway. And he has this real problem that it's a fractal, and he keeps zooming in and he keeps finding more variation. And he's trying to keep modeling that. So he's been working on it for several centuries and still hasn't found, hasn't been able to actually remake them the way they are. Anyway, and that's the kind of problem we also can have when we deal with distributed models. So the other key thing, and when we start talking about these distributed models, is of course about data, because data is essential for all the modeling. And I'll talk a little bit more about remote sensing and data collection, because Ignacio has done a lot of work in this area. Maybe you already know about this, but I think it's a good example. So despite the huge increase in data collection that we have using remote sensing, there are still significant challenges. One of the things is really to think about what do we actually call data? Because often we work with proxies rather than actual data. So a big example of that, of course, is we talk about stream flow as being data, but stream flow, almost no one actually measures stream flow in time or in space at a regular way, right? We measure actually river height and we infer discharge or stream flow, right? We use a rating curve to actually come up with the actual stream flow value. So we're actually using a proxy, and you can think about a lot of these things, whether it's a soil map or whether it's there's different ways where we actually have kind of extrapolated the information, or we use a proxy to actually talk about the data. And with satellite information, remote sensing, this is particularly true. And again, it comes down to the scale of observation versus the scale of the process. What's the size of your pixel that you're actually looking at? Then there is the issue of missing data, there's often missing data, and how do you deal with missing data? And then when you think about time, there are these dynamic processes. Even in this rating curve that we've got here, this is quite a tight rating curve. We can see that depending on what year you are, you might have different measurements, and those measurements might vary, and there's uncertainty within the measurement. So you have an uncertainty associated with the actual rating curve. All right, so in general, we can simplify models, and that's what we generally do. And the reason why that is that complexity currently beats good intentions. We'd love to be as complex as we are, but we really can't. So we generally take a practical approach, which is simplify the process. But of course, that by itself introduces uncertainty because we now have simplified the processes. There's a lack of fit, there's parameter uncertainty, there's a whole bunch of different things that are happening, right? And a big example of simplified models and approach on that is this paper by Farmer, but there's a couple of other papers in that sort of direction where essentially you start looking at, okay, how complex should my model be to be able to capture the processes? And what you do is you build these models, or you test them against the series. You go, oh, well, this one predicts the stream flow fine without introducing further parameters. So it's useful to try and make that prediction. So it must be the right model. There's some philosophical issues around that as well, but it's an approach that a lot of people take. So another way of kind of doing that is taking a data-based approach, right? Just trying to think about that again and just saying, well, what if I use the data and then again use a simple model, but trying to use just the actual data to come up with this cause and effect relationship, and then basically using trend analysis. So you can think of a simple model of local hydrology as being just the flow equals the precipitation plus some interaction between precipitation and ET, because, actual ET is a function of both wetness and the actual radiation that's incoming. Some seasonal signals, maybe ENSO signals, and some memory. And the memory, I mean autocorrelation, things like groundwater input and slow path input. So there's some, the rainfall from last year will still have an impact on the actual stream flow from this year in certain systems. And so you need to take into account some sort of memory. Then there are some trends, and then there might be some noise, right? Some things, your measurement errors. So if you model, if you have an understand, if you try and capture all the ones that you know, and you try and model those, you try and include those in your simulation model, then what you can observe is the residuals, and the residuals are essentially then whatever trends there are plus whatever error, residuals you have. So if you remove all the other signals, then you're left with whatever you're trying to study, and that you might be able to focus on, assuming that the residual error isn't too big. So, just graphical, there's your data, there's your model, there are your residuals, and you go, okay, can I actually explain what's happening here? That, again, not saying that's easy, but that's one approach you could take based on the data. So we've done that for a couple of studies. And again, I'm not arguing this is the world's best work, but it's just saying this is an example of how you might take that. So this is some work we did in Uruguay from the Santa Lucia catchment. And so we used a conceptual model, GeO4J, to fit to long time series that we had from the data. And then we used remote sensing to extract a thing called forest cover. And we had data on the water licenses. So here's the forest cover increase in those catchments. And there's a couple of sub-catchments. They're nested. C3 is the smallest catchment. C2 is the middle-sized catchment, and C1 is the overall catchment. And we can see there's trends in the forestry, and the smallest catchment has the steepest increase, while the bigger catchment doesn't seem to change very much, and the C2 has a trend. The water license in all of them increase steeply, right? And particularly we saw when we analyzed it, we saw that the forest cover effect is much greater than the water license effect, right? So the bigger change in forest cover gives a bigger change in the actual amount of stream flow that's reduced. but the effect was actually smaller in the smallest catchment. We don't actually know why that is, right? So why would the effect of the actual forest impact be smaller in the smallest catchment? And so one thinking could be because of differences in soils or differences in location of where the actual forestry is, or things like that. So, and the other thing is the percentage-wise forest cover and licenses are greater in those actual catchment, even though the effect was the smallest. So, we're struggling with that explanation, but it was just showing that you can then look at that and you can look at what would be the effect so the red line is if you have no forest cover, the blue line is if you have no water license change, and the black line is what we observed in terms of stream flow frequency curve. So we did that a bit more complex, and again, I think this was actually in the end the approach was too complex, but that was the way we tried this. If we have changes in the relationship between runoff and rainfall due to climate change, so this is one of the big arguments or big discussions within Australia in the literature, is the fundamental relationship between runoff and rainfall changing because of changes in the climate. And so what we thought to try and take away some of the effects, because there could be multiple effects that are actually changing the relationship between runoff and rainfall. And the older studies were mixing catchments that were partly agricultural, partly urban, whatever else. We thought we'd concentrate only on some forested catchments and only look at smaller catchments, less than 250 square kilometers. That's a small catchment in Australia, probably also in Chile. But when I talk about this in Europe, then everybody goes, what? Okay, well, but it's a small catchment. And what we did, we combined conceptual modeling and generalized additive models. And the whole idea was trying to remove the effect of climate and climate change and then check if there's still residual trends. And so what you can look at then, and so this is all just purely a statistical analysis. So, this is a really complex diagram of how we did everything, but in the end, it comes down to looking at the residuals. So what we found is that there's only a few catchments, and particularly in the southeast of Australia, because some of these catchments are somewhere else, that show actually significant trends. But the other thing is, if you look at this, the actual trend, because that's times 10 to the minus 4, are actually very, very small. Yes, there is a change due to climate change, or there is a fundamental change, not due to climate change, there's a fundamental change in the relationship between runoff and rainfall, but it's tiny, it's very small. We can, so we looked at that then also from a stochastic point of view. If you actually try and rerun this a couple of times and look at, distributions, then you can see that there are only a few catchments where it actually falls outside kind of a stochastic distribution, a resampling of this actual effect. And, some of them show a change in the rainfall runoff relationship, that mainly in Southeast Australia, the effect is very small, less than 1 millimeter a year, and the effect is really borderline significant. And there's much less impact that we found compared to some of the traditional modeling. And so there's a whole GitHub that you can look at in terms of the actual research, if you would like to repeat this. So remote sensing and new monitoring is promising a lot and could be a real power in terms of trying to improve a hydrological model. And I strongly believe that it will in the future, except it's not yet there, but it is at the moment. It is definitely something it's moving in that direction. It gives us great power to try and observe things that we haven't been able to observe for a long time. For example, we are currently, without remote sensing, we're unable to observe evapotranspiration at any spatial scales. We're really looking always at point observations. So satellite data has a great potential for flood observation, dam volumes, but also evapotranspiration, soil moisture, and it can be integrated with models. And so there are many products with data at different time and space scales, but one of the key things that we're finding more and more, there is no continuous data in both space and time, right? So we might have observations in space and very detailed in space, but then often we have very limited time increments. Or the other way around, we might have observations in space, but not in time. Or the other way around, we have it in time, but not in space as well. So I have coarse scales at space, but fine scales in time. It's excellent for mapping, and it can be transformed into quantifiable units. So it really has good potential. And of course, so this is some of the work from Ignacio that he's done. So looking at, can we actually observe inundated areas using MODIS imagery? So this was using MODIS, which is quite coarse scale, 500 millimeters. But you can, you can observe groundwater, or you observe surface water, so standing water. You can observe that reasonably well. This is, of course, a large catchment, it's about 44,000 square kilometers. But you can actually look at these volumes and look at these actual, surface water that is there, and you can calculate volumes using the DEM, as he's also showing here. You can actually look at that in terms of looking at the actual volumes, and you get good correlations between the actual stream flow observations and the actual flood events. So all that works quite well. We can also look at the soil moisture. Again, this is work by Ignacio. I have to acknowledge that he's done a lot of this work, and it's doing it very well. This was around looking at being able to observe soil water content, as we know, because this is still a major issue, and soil water is, I think, one of the most important variables that we'd like to get a handle on. One of the key problems is that, again, observations of soil moisture are at real scales. So actual measured observations of soil moisture are very scarce. We found probably about 35 or something like that actual observation points, and even those are questionable, some of those. But if you compare traditional modeling of the soil moisture using a land surface model to what the remote sensing data can do, and this is downscaling the remote sensing that Ignacio had done, you can see that the remote sensing does a much better job than the gray that's in the background, gray bars in the background, which is the land surface model, right? The nice thing is you can do this almost in real time because it depends on your satellite recurrence. The problem with it, of course, it requires modeling. So there's actually also, there is some, you can update it because it's a database model, so you can update it every time, but it requires computational resources to keep doing that regularly and to be able to update that all the time to do the update. But it is usable, and it is something that we can now observe these water balance elements at reasonable scales. So again, this is going somewhere, but maybe not yet totally where we want to be. Evapotranspiration is even more struggling, is more difficult. So there's a lot of evapotranspiration work in satellite data. There are many products out there that are actual evapotranspiration, or at least are said to be actual evapotranspiration. When we start comparing this, and this is something that we're haven't fully worked out. So a lot of these actual evapotranspiration models in satellite data are based on observations of flux towers. Now there are very limited number of flux towers across the world. And so when you actually start looking at the comparisons with flux towers, there are really, again, so there are only about 33 across the whole of Australia. And so we have a continent which is 3,000 by 3,000 kilometers, and we have 33 observation points, right, and individual points. And we're trying to then make an assessment of satellite evapotranspiration data. The other thing, the points are really biased. They're all on the coastline or near the coast. So they're not very far away, maybe 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers from the coast. So they have a certain bias in terms of the actual vegetation systems that they look at. And so when you start investigating how well it does, so this is looking at sap flow. So we measured actually in the tree, you have actual transpiration, and you compare sap flow to actually an estimate of evapotranspiration. These blue dots here at the bottom are actually a local scale, point scale model. That seems to do the best job in trying to recover the sap flow because it's calibrated on the sap flow. So of course it does. if you compare it to some of the other large scale modeling, you can see all of that well overestimates the actual evapotranspiration. And what we've, so there's a problem there. And so we're not sure whether it's related. In this case, we were not sure whether it's related to local variation. Does the satellite see more the local subflow? Does it see the understory vegetation? Does it see the soil evaporation? Or is there a consistent model bias, right? That's the real question. So one way you can go about that is, of course, is just post-processing. So you can post-process, of course, the data. So if you look at the satellite evapotranspiration, you look at the field evapotranspiration, you can again look at the residuals, and you can see in terms of, easily measured other satellite information, what are the main predictors of actually those components. So you can see that ET is mainly dominated by this radiation and land surface temperature, and maybe a little bit of soil moisture, and then not very much about some vegetation parameters. If you look at the field measured, so the sap flow, it's not related to any of those. Well, there's one site where there's a bit related to that. Most cases, it's not even related. The only thing that sometimes comes out is leaf area index, right? So really, the evapotranspiration is actually much more dominated by this whole radiation input, and that creates then a problem. So again, looking at the residuals and analyzing that, you can extrapolate, then you can simulate the residuals and extrapolate that across time and space to be able to actually make predictions of what actual ET would be from the actual vegetation. Again, we focus on tree sap flow. We haven't measured the understory. We don't measure the soil evaporation. All this could be a reason why it's the mismatch. This is just because we were interested in the trees, and we wanted to predict ETs and trees. And it's a clear example how the actual ET from the satellite tends to show different results than what we actually measure in the field from, say, observations in the trees. And you can see that particularly in the summer, it overpredicts the evapotranspiration relative to the observed data. And so it's too much for the tree vegetation. It's too much radiation driven and doesn't take into account the stresses that are actually there in the vegetation. Now, I don't know whether that's true also for, say, agricultural crops, or whether that's also true for area, because we haven't looked at that, but it just shows you that visual spectrum remote sensing does not account sufficiently for stress in the actual plants. This is again some work from Ignacio. So I'm just piggybacking off his success. Not his success is my success, I always say, right? So this was the work he did in terms of looking at the actual water levels in dams, in farm dams, and it's pretty amazing what you can observe and how well you can do that, and how well you can actually observe these actual farm dams at that scale using Sentinel-2 data, because it's 10 meter by 10 meter pixels, so you get these fantastic observations. That's not saying there are no problems. There are definitely some issues with that. And again, if you have got a fine scale DEM, you can then intersect the DEM and you can calculate water levels and come up with volumes within these water dams. So for water accounting, which we're interested in this case, and water, trying to track where all the water is, this is a tool that works quite well. It's quite interesting to as a development, but you need a fine scale DEM. You need a cloudless days, and so you can try and look at that. And so we're trying to look at whether you can get these volume level curves. That's what we developed here, and you can then look actually at the actual uncertainty related to that as well. So you can actually figure out how well does your volume level actually a volume level curve, and how does your volume actually, how sure are you about your volume. There are a whole bunch of assumptions. And so it really, here in this case, we're just estimating uncertainty of the partly flooded pixels. The problem we have a 10 by 10 meter pixel, and right at the edges of the dam, there's quite high uncertainty in terms of where the water actually is. So that's the reason why we need to include that as uncertainty. Anyway, here's some of, again, Ignacio's work, looking at that, showing the uncertainty, and then you can then actually look at the dam level, the volumes in the dam, and the associated uncertainty over time, and you get a confidence interval of that prediction. So it was a good first start on this. I mean, there's a lot more work I think we can be doing around this, but it's definitely one of those areas that can only develop better in the future. So how are we going in terms of quantifying prediction uncertainty within actual hydrology? Well, most prediction uncertainty approaches in hydrology concentrate on this parameter and a model of structure uncertainty and post-processing errors. You know, whatever the literature you look at, particularly post-processing errors is really the focus of most of the work that's going on in this area. All right, so the question is there another approach, such as the Where's All the Water project that we've done with DARE, and a PhD project, one of my new PhD candidates, Rajita, that he's working on. So I'll give a quick overview of that. So in terms of uncertainty quantification of water balance, the idea was that we can develop a probability. So the overall thinking was, if you can develop probability distributions for each uncertain component within a catchment model, then you can come up with the overall uncertainty, right? So can you actually do that from a data-based approach? And can you do that so by actually modeling the uncertainty for each individual component? And so we're looking at a pilot study, again, in the Namoi, where we're looking at a short part of the river. And we wanted to demonstrate the uncertainty quantification of the evapotranspiration, the stream gauging, and some of the groundwater modeling. So we didn't get very far, but the whole idea is if you can actually look at just the processes within the river, and you can actually come up with the actual uncertainty for each of the processes, then can you incorporate all that to come up with some uncertainty of the stream flow, right? So we made some initial attempts at that. What we found is that actually the biggest uncertainty is in the rating curve, as a lot of people probably know. You can solve these groundwater heads and fluxes with uncertainty, and basically what you're doing is you're mimicking a mod flow model, and you're doing that from using basically a spatial interpolation approach, and then you can come up with, you know, uncertainties related to all the gradients and derivative terms that you need to actually run the partial differential equations to model the groundwater. It works, and so that allows you to kind of identify new or better monitoring locations. You can compare this to actually standard numerical modeling, which is what we're doing currently. We're trying to run mod flow models and I'm doing the comparison with this. At the moment, the uncertainty in the ET estimates is really small, but that's because we were concentrating on the purely on the assuming that the ET itself, the measurement is correct, right? We're looking at the interpolation question. And one of the things was that if you actually try and calculate the evapotranspiration from the actual river, you need, again, we came back to basically Ignacio's problem, that is, how wide is the river? And what's the shape of the river? How deep is it? Do we have bathymetry for the river? And do we know something about the depth? And we don't always have that. So it creates another uncertainty. The rating curves we already talked about. There's issues, but you can also come up with a polynomial function that you can actually look at that and come up with an uncertainty as well, and look at the changes in the rating curve over time and model that. So that's work that's also continuing. If you start doing that, you can then insert that back into your inflow and outflow prediction, and you can come up with some sort of uncertainty. And you can see that our uncertainty in the inflows in this section were much larger than the uncertainty in the outflow, because we have only one gauging station at the outflow, and we've got 3 gauging stations at the inflow. So it's all a bit preliminary. This is not a final work that we want to go to, but you can see that there are these, you know, ways of actually starting to quantify some of the uncertainties within the process. Rajita is taking a slightly different approach. What he's doing is using a Bayesian hierarchical network model to predict, or a Bayesian hierarchical model. It's not actually a network model, Bayesian hierarchical model to predict daily stream flow using covariates. And so there's 2 covariates that he's using at the moment, but you can include other covariates. One is stream flow at the other upstream, any upstream gauges, and the other one is spatially average rainfall received in the older upstream area. And we're thinking about including soil moisture or groundwater. The problem with that one, again, you're using the model data, are you actually using observed data, but it's the same problem with rainfall, stream flow. So, and at the moment, we're not finding that it gives us much extra power. What it does then is then you're looking at a mixture model. So you're mixturing different distributions to try and use a mixture of these distributions to try and predict the stream flow. So you can look at it one way. You first have to check if the stream flow is 0 or not 0. And if it's then you can model the probability of the stream flow being 0. And you can think about that as a direct delta function, and you can model it that way. You can also about the probability of stream flow not being 0. And then once that's going on, you can have gamma distribution, and not only just one gamma distribution, we can have a mixture of gamma distributions. So we tested that first to just non-zero flow series. So this is a data set that has no non-zero flows, or no zero flows. It's all non-zero, so all data values. And what you can see, and that's quite interesting, is the sort of the green and red here at the bottom are actually the two different gamma distributions that are modeled. So you can see the model switches between the red one and the green one, depending on whether you have more flow or you have less flow. And if there's less flow, it uses the green model. If there's more flow, it uses the red model. So it switches very nicely between the different gamma distributions. You can extend this to 3 or 4 or 5 different mixtures, so it's flexible enough to do that. So it's a real nice, close to real-time prediction model that works that way, and you can extend this, of course, into a forecasting model. That's the whole idea. All right, what can we learn from the example? So despite all the cool modeling, we're still some distance away from understanding management impact, right? We can observe differently, we can analyze more historical data, but how do we actually incorporate all this into decisions, right? So it relies on this good data, good models, and good calibration. And we really don't know yet what is acceptable uncertainty. And we even if we can define uncertainty, we can't really yet define what is acceptable uncertainty. Now, the trend analysis did is, of course, very interesting, or maybe not very interesting to you, but to me, it's very interesting. But the problem about it is it's only post hoc, right? You can only do this afterwards. You can't do this in real time. Satellite data might work. We can deserve more and more detail, but there's a mismatch between the satellite and the ground truth. And so we need further modeling and certainly quantification. So what about the stakeholders, right? So if you want to try and have trust, then if you want to have policy and management, then you really need trust in the model outcomes, the Murray-Darling Basin example. And we've just went through that basically a perfect model is a dream, right? We're not going to be able to build a perfect model. So acceptance is going to be based on this idea of credibility, salience, and legitimacy, right? And if you have stakeholder integration, you can build this credibility and this legitimacy. And the idea is that you do this co-design and continuous feedback loops. So we implemented that, for example, in there, but also in the Water Sense project and in the Uruguay project before. So I'll talk a little bit again about Uruguay, the project I'm doing in Uruguay. So the whole idea is that we do some modeling with stakeholders. It generally works like you have a group of experts that run the models, they discuss the result with stakeholders, they revise the models to incorporate the feedback, and back to one, right? So we wanted to approach this differently. We thought, what can we combine capacity building within a group of people in different organizations with actual scenario modeling? So the whole idea is if we get a group of representative of the different decision makers within water management, if we can get them trained in modeling, or at least to understand modeling, even if they don't actually run the models themselves, they get a better understanding of actual models, then we can do this ownership and co-design, and we can bring these continuous feedback loops in. All right, so we did that, we tried that, we did. It seems to work all right. Our group, which we set up 5 years ago, is still working together. They work across 3 different ministries, and INEA, their agriculture research organization in Uruguay. So it seems to work all right. They still work together. They feed it up to their superiors. Their superiors are very enthusiastic about it. We give regular, showcases of what they're doing. They work on different catchments now, not just the one Santa Lucia, which was a pilot. They now work on a different other catchments. So there is this continuous integration of the knowledge and feedback with the stakeholders. So that seems to really help with actual getting some acceptance of the actual modeling that's being done. But we're using SWOT, and the problem with SWOT is that it's actually quite complex. It's too complex, I would say. There's too many parameters, and understanding the process is really crucial. The process of training and working with stakeholders is really slow. It takes a long time before you get to this digital twin level, but there is this major gain in knowledge. You get a recognition that there is additional data needed. There's a recognition of all the model processes. So there's an ongoing project where I'm going to Uruguay again, while I was going to Uruguay and passing through Chile, which runs till 2025. And so that's some recognition that at least works. And so the whole idea is it's a co-designing of research that really is important here. And it's an important part of this working with stakeholders. You want to develop this common understanding of the problem. You want to design the research steps together. You're combining capacity building and the research, and it works really well. And that's also what we're doing in DARE. So in DARE, we have this big focus on the actual working with stakeholders and working with our partners, trying to make sure that we all together understand what the problem is, together design the research, together talk about the research, build the capacity, as well as actually delivering the research. But it can be tricky if you involve PhD candidates, because you're trying to balance this problem solving for the partner, which they want, with academic requirements, which is novelty, which is some outstanding research that you want for in terms of academic output, things like that. So it can be quite a slow process. There's IP issues, things like that. One thing, of course, that we already talked about, but also is really important, that one way to create this credibility, legitimacy for models is to keep focusing on open access and reproducible research. And I know in Chile, you're good at that as well. We're looking at data provenance, but also at model provenance. So what has someone done with a model, and trying to build better model documentation, documented workflows. I just reviewed a paper, which hopefully will come out at some point, even though it's a very small case study, but it's a clear example how in a collaboration between a consultancy company and a government department, things can go quite wrong, where the consultancy company kind of does the work and the modeling, then hands over the report to the government organization. The government organization really has no idea what actually happens within the model, what decisions were made, and how they came to the results. Right? So it's important that we have these model documentation, documented workflows that are interpretable actually by the users, the people who actually use the model, and that depends on the users. Of course, there's some options that we have, but the idea is that your models might not be perfect, but at least you can scrutinize them. So in the end, quantifiable state of water management remains a challenge. Sorry, I think I went over time. Often need to resort to negotiation and consultation, but models are needed with these complex environment, but we need trust in these model outcomes scenarios. So it requires three components: clear cause and effect relationships, quantified uncertainty, and stakeholder involvement and open access. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vervoort. I think the presentation was really interesting, at least to me. I enjoyed a lot of the presentation, the talk. I would like to remind the audience, because we have people in the Zoom and also on YouTube, that you can write your question in the chat, so both audiences can hear the same questions and the same answers. Okay, so I would like to start with one question about your final words. So you showed these meetings with stakeholders in Uruguay, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's very interesting, because that doesn't happen too much, and it's very complex to, I don't know, summarize hydrological modeling to people that are not, I don't know, related to hydrological models.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. So yes. So
I have two questions for that. Is how difficult it was to, I don't know, share the knowledge with them? And that's the first question. And the second one is, did you learn something about the way they think, and how should we change the way we model or do things in science to address these very complex problems?
Yes. So how do we do it? So the key thing there was to try. You have to be patient. I mean, you have to have the time to do this and be really invested in this combination of capacity building. And so you need to think about budgets and, you know, the way you incorporate that within your project. This combination of capacity building, so training, and actual working on the real problem. So the way we did it there is we got together with the actual different ministerios and asked for them, said them, we want to set up this group where we have people who are interested in modeling or want to work with models, working together on a pilot catchment first, but later on other catchments, where we will train them and give them understanding of these models, but also where they can show them results to you about what they did, and they can explain the model to you, right? I'm not going to explain to it, they will explain the model to you. So that's the whole idea. And they were saying, yes, this is good. And they assigned a group of people. And after the first year, they thought, this is great, we need to keep doing this. So, and it was a lot of investment in time. It basically means that every time I'm in Uruguay, I actually teach both a course, or I do a capacity building course, as well as doing individual consultation on models or working on the actual research problem, right? So, but, you know, once you get it started and you get universities involved, there's opportunities for training in terms of master's projects, there's opportunities in terms of training into PhDs. So there's this whole extension. So there's all this, there's opportunities for everybody. The ministries get better trained people, they get insights, they get results. It's the investment, and on the other end there is there's for the people who are involved, they get training, they get build their careers, you know, they extend their careers. For the universities, there's people they can train, they can tick off that we've got trained another master student. There's opportunities for funding that you can ask, that you can combine with that. So it's, yeah, you have to be creative, you have to try and build it together, but that works really well. What I have learned myself is that I understand a lot less about the models that I actually use than I thought I was. So every time I try to explain things and explain them further and try and break it down in terms of what actually is happening, the more I understand of the actual model myself, right? We often grab a model off the shelf, we run it, we kind of understand these are the processes, here's a diagram, but what actually happens and what happens when you change certain parameters, what are some of the interactions and things like that, we often kind of skip over that, particularly when we have a limited time to do something. So they actually, yeah, the more you work with this, the more you start thinking, well, is this actually working? This is, you know, is this really a good model? Everybody talks about this being a good model, but what actually is in here, right? Once you start opening the box, there's all kinds of things that pop out you might not want to see.
Yeah, thank you for the question. If anyone has questions, please just write them in the chat so I can read them to Professor Vervoort. And I have another question related to what you just said about these models, if we like them or not. And the more we use it, the more we are scared of them sometimes. So how do you do that in Australia? Because in your presentation, you talked about lumped models, distributed models. What kind of models do you use in Australia, or are you implementing in Australia? And are you planning to move to more, I don't know, complex models, distributed models, or something like that?
So this explains my interest in satellite data, right? Because I'd like to move to more complex distributed models, but to be able to run those, you actually need to have the data, particularly if you want to do it at these larger scales. If you have a catchment of, 50,000 square kilometers, how are you going to find the detailed data? I mean, I can put data in it, but essentially it's a random number generator. So how am I going to check that the model is actually giving me the outputs that actually make sense? I can always calibrate a model on on stream flow. There's no problem to model calibrate a model on stream flow. So in the end, if we think about the model and being able to do the processes, it should also be able to predict the soil moisture. It should also be able to predict the evapotranspiration. It should also be able to predict the plant growth. So it needs to be able to do all those, and that way you can check that variation. And there's another paper that we worked on initially where we started using satellite data in lump models, and that didn't work at all. As soon as you started also including the satellite data, the model couldn't predict the stream flow, or the other way around. So yes, we need to understand better of how these models are, and this is still an area of research I'm really interested in, is how do these simpler models actually predict evapotranspiration? And if we want them to be useful in changing climates, they need to be able to both predict evapotranspiration and predict stream flow, because conceptually, if the evapotranspiration changes, then the stream flow should change, right? So it should both be able to predict it. The water balance is closed, right? So if it's not, then we're not understanding the process. There must be other things happening. So that's kind of where I think we're going. And so we're more complex models. Yes, we can go there. I'd love to go that way, but we need a lot more information to be able to feed it into. And so we can slowly build up. We will never go, in the end, we'll run into this same boundary that we cannot model all the processes. We're going to have to average somewhere, but we need to understand what the uncertainty is of that average that we're taking.
Yeah, thank you. There is a question in the chat by Ignacio Fuentes. So thanks, Ignacio, for your question. He says, well, I've seen many papers applying hydrologic modeling using a single outlet, even though the studied catchment are quite large and the landscape is quite variable. Here's the question. So why do you think that those studies keep being accepted and published while a regional characterization is missing?
It's a very good question, Ignacio. And clearly, when that paper got accepted, I wasn't the reviewer. Because I think these papers, I think we have to just generally, you have to be very critical when you read the literature. I mean, at the moment, the literature is so vast. There are so many papers, so many journals, some of them very predatory, some of them will accept almost anything. You as a reader need to be almost become your own reviewer. And so this is a very good point that you're raising. And this is the thing, yeah, if you have only one single outlet and there's no context and you have a very large catchment, as long as you have enough parameters within your model, you can tweak the parameters of the model to fit the stream flow. It really isn't a problem, right? But you know, whether that actually is a real prediction of the stream flow, or whether, and so, you know, validation can be one thing. We always see the validation performance drop down quite considerably. That's one way. The DSST, you know, going back to this, again, a very old paper by Clemis, right? Where you could look at the differential split sample tests. Yeah. So if you test a model on two similar climate series, then it has to do well. If it doesn't do well on two similar climate series, then the model is bad anyway. Then the big challenge is, can it do to contrasting climate series, a wet and a dry period? If it cannot do that, then something is wrong about the actual processes. And that's the thing, coming back to the evapotranspiration and the question of, you know, does the model the processes right? If we're just making a short-term prediction, so we just want to make a short-term forecast, 1 month, maybe up to maybe a year, maybe then we can do this kind of tweaking a model to a single outlet and use it for that. When we go anywhere beyond that, that won't work, right? Because we then create a problem in terms of that. You know, when you lose that actual understanding of how it actually works. So in terms of why they get being published, I think that's just bad reviewing and bad editorial processes. And I think that's at the moment rife. I have quite a low appreciation for most of the reviewing that's happening. I notice people are doing a great job and doing very well. Yeah, so if your paper gets rejected, don't feel bad. Definitely, if it gets rejected by me, don't feel bad. Just read the comments and see how it goes through, what's actually in there, right? I get lots of papers rejected. I'm I'm an editorial board, but I'm still get lots of papers rejected. So don't feel bad about it either. It just happens. But yeah, there's you have to try and think about clarity and making sure that it's, yeah, even for yourself, you want to make sure it's right. There was an interesting tweet the other day there was something on Twitter the other day where, and even though I have my concerns about Twitter even now, there was an interesting thing that was on there that said, it should be, the research is really good. That's why it gets published in a high quality journal, or the high quality journal accepts it. Now it seems to be, it's published in a high quality journal, so it must be good research. And that's not necessarily true. The reverse is not necessarily true.
I think we are almost out of time, but I still have one question. So you showed a lot of data or observations or I don't know, proxies for other hydrological processes to compare the models with this data. Have you tried to calibrate some processes of any hydrological model with this data?
Yeah.
I mean, beyond streamflow. I mean, I don't know, evapotranspiration or soil moisture, and what are your thoughts about that? Are we, because now we have a lot of I don't know, remote sensing products from a lot of agencies, but not all of them are good or good enough or at the scale that we need the data. So I don't know if you can tell us more about your experience.
Yeah. So this is why I'm interested in this area, right? And this is why Ignacio, when he worked with me, worked on this observed data from remote sensing, because that to me, that's the next frontier. We need to understand this. I have included in the models, but I haven't been very successful yet. So I've done a little bit of work in this area, and so the thing that I'm finding the more I learn, about this, the more I find that there is all kinds of issues with the actual remote sensing data itself. And so that's the reason why I was doing this work now with the subflow, to try and look at that observation, because that was the whole idea. I was going to use remote sensing data. Oh, that's great. I've got remote sensing. I'm just going to train the model. I'm going to use remote sensing for the and streamflow. I'm going to combine these two, and then, I'll have a better model. Well, so there's two problems. One is the model struggles with that if the model is too simplified. And secondly, the remote sensing data is not very good. And so you're trying to fit something to data that's not very good. The other problem that you have is streamflow has a lot of variation. And you'll find that if you have streamflow that has a strong seasonal signal, you'll predict that much better than if it doesn't have a seasonal signal. All right? Evapotranspiration has a very strong seasonal signal. So the model will actually fit the seasonal signal fairly well. It can't do the variation, but it'll fit that quite easily. So it actually doesn't use the information that's in the evapotranspiration data very well, because it's got such a strong seasonal signal. So you almost have to, so this is where the next step I'm working on is, in the calibration, you actually need to remove first the seasonal signal and then calibrate on the residual of the evapotranspiration for both the model and the actual. So the actual optimization has to be purely on the residual, not on the actual seasonal signal, because otherwise it will just fit the seasonal signal and go, tick, that's done, and then concentrate on trying to tweak the model to get the streamflow right, which doesn't have the seasonal signal. So yes, and soil moisture, same thing. If there's a strong seasonal signal, soil moisture data, I think remote sensing soil moisture data is even more. We've done some work in that too. Another PhD candidate that I had, Dipankar Kundu, did quite some work on trying to look at remote sensing of soil moisture and how you include that into a model. into the SWOT model. It can all be done. It works quite well. You can do it both in a data assimilation step, or you can use it as a actual calibration tool. But again, it depends on the quality of the soil moisture data and whether it actually provides information into your stream flow. You know, is there actually this connection again? And so the work that Rajita is doing, he was trying to include soil moisture data, but it really didn't help his database model. The two strong predictors were always going to be the upstream stream flow, of course, and the rainfall.
Thank you so much, Professor. We are on time. So thanks again for your presentation. I know it's very early in Australia right now, so thanks for...
That's my own fault. I should have known I needed the visa.
Oh, anyway, thanks anyway. So yes, thank you. And I would like to remind the audience in Zoom and YouTube that we have a next seminar on March 23rd by Daniela Henry. So I hope you all enjoy this this presentation and attend the next seminars. So thanks again, Professor Vervoort.
See you all. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.